Okay, I'm going to get started by just welcoming all of you guys. Sawadee Kap, welcome to Wat Tung Yu. Welcome to all of you guys joining us online as well. We're going to start our class today with some meditation, and then after we meditate, I'm going to move into the topics that we have to discuss today, which is what is Kamma and how does it affect me? This is a natural law that is affecting us whether we realize it or not, and it's important not to believe in any of these things, but to be able to see the truth for yourself. So I'm going to explain to you what this natural law is, even though I've been teaching that all the way through the course, and then I'm going to help you to understand how this relates to your life and how you can make wise decisions to produce wholesome results rather than making unwise decisions to produce unwholesome results. Then afterwards, we're going to take a break and then come back from break, and we're going to discuss what is merit. This is a unique type of wholesome Kamma. Then after our lunch, we have a topic of integrating the teachings into your life. I'm going to teach you about how to do that so that you can integrate them into your life. We're going to talk about continued support as well. So welcome to all of you guys here. Welcome to everyone who's joining us online. If you'd like to join for the meditation, I usually start with this chant, and we're going to ease into the meditation with the chanting. Remember, this isn't a rite or ritual or ceremony or worship. This is just to help ease the mind into meditation, actually get more benefit out of the meditation itself. That in the teachings of the Buddha, there is no rites, rituals, ceremonies, or worship. There's not prayer or anything like that. Instead, you're training your mind to move to this enlightened mental state where the mind's peaceful, calm, serene, and content with joy. These chants, I suspect, were created by his students either during his life or after his death, because they used chanting during his life in order to commit the teachings to memory, and they didn't use chanting for anything other than that he would teach orally, and as he taught orally, the students every 2 weeks would chant his teachings as a way to remember them. And then after we do the chanting, I'm going to provide you some guidance in the meditation while we're actually meditating. Then there'll be a period of time where it'll just be quiet, and we'll just be meditating together. Those of us here at the temple, everyone online, will just be meditating together. And then after that, we'll come out of the meditation with some more chanting before I move into today's topics. So if you'd like to make yourself comfortable, there's 4 positions that the Buddha taught, which is seated, lying, standing, and walking. I taught walking meditation yesterday, so if at any point you guys would like to do walking meditation, you're more than welcome. And usually when we're meditating together, we meditate in the seated, lying, or standing, but there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do some walking meditation if you'd like to do that, if you feel like you would like to. So again, if you'd like to join with the chanting, you're welcome to join in, and then I'll come back with some guidance. Arahang Samma Sambuddho Mahakawa Bhutang Mahakavanhang Abhivateyami Savakato Mahakavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami Supatipano Mahakavato Savaka Sangho Sanghang Namami Namo Rasa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Rasa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Rasa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Iti pisu Mahakawa Arahang Samma Sambuddho ชาจารนังสัมมุโนสกาโตโรกาวิโตอนุเตโรปุริสาดามาสติสัตตาตาวามนุสนังปุโตภาควาติ Okay, with the lower body and hands and arms comfortable, in the upper body erect, just close the eyes and start breathing in through the nose and out through the nose. Here you're just looking to establish the breath, a nice, natural, steady, consistent breath. Not forced or controlled, just a gradual inhale through the nose, experiencing the full breath. And then when you're ready, exhale out through the nose. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. Your breath may not match up with the guidance that I'm providing, and that's okay. This is your practice. I'm just here for guidance. You can use this voice as a reminder that whenever you get to the next inhale, breathing gradually through the nose, establishing a nice, natural, steady, consistent breath. And then when you're ready, exhale out through the nose, experiencing the full breath. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. Once the breath is well established, start fixating the mind on the breath, either the sound of the breath coming into the nose or the sensation of air moving over the skin into the nose. The breath is the present moment. Fixate the mind on the breath, the present moment. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. With the mind fixated on the breath, whenever you notice that it moves off the breath, cut that off, let it go, and come back to the breath, the present moment. No need to observe the thought, label it, judge it, analyze it, or even try to figure out where it's coming from. Whenever you notice that the mind is moved off the breath, Cut that off, let it go, and come back to the breath, the present moment. Breathing in and out. Breathing in and out. I'm going to be quiet now and let you do this work of focusing on the breath, cutting off and letting go anytime the mind moves off the breath. You have nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. No one needs you right now. This is your time to focus on the breath. Breathing in and out. ระหังสัมมาสัมพุทโธมะคะวะโหตังมะคะวันนังอภิวาเทมิสวากขาโตมะคะวะตาธัมโมธัมมังนามัสสามิสุปฏิปันโนภะคะวะโตสาวกสังโฆสังฆังนามามินะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะอิติปิโสภะคะวะอะระหังสัมมาสัมพุทโธวิชาจารณังสัมมุโนสัคคาโตโรกาวิโตอนุเตโรภูริสาธัมมาสติสัตตาตาวามานุสนังโอโตภะคะวะติ Okay, if you guys would like to slowly make your way out of meditation. Once again, welcome to all of you guys. Welcome. Nice to see you all here. Those of you that are joining us here and everyone who is online, those of you guys that joined us since we started meditating, welcome to all of you. I'm going to be sharing with you this morning this topic of what is Kamma and how does it affect me. When we talk about awakening to enlightenment in the Buddhist teachings on this path to enlightenment, this is what you're awakening to, is you're awakening to the wisdom of this natural law of Kamma. This word Kamma is oftentimes used as karma. If you might have heard that word, it's from the Sanskrit language, where the word Kamma is from the Pali language. This is the original language, or the original teachings of the Buddha are in the Pali language. So people who study the original teachings of the Buddha will tend to use the word Kamma instead of karma. If they translated to just one English word, I would use that word instead, because it'd be much easier for everyone if we just spoke English. But there's two words in the teachings of the Buddha that don't translate to just one English word, so I still need to use the Pali words in those cases, and this is one of those cases where I need to use the word Kamma. This natural law is not something that anyone should ever believe in. You don't believe in things in order to get to enlightenment. It's not believe, and then hope something good happens when you die. Instead, you're cultivating wisdom, and the wisdom that you're cultivating is about this natural law of cause and effect, or action and result. Because the reason why you're experiencing the things that you experience in life is due to the lack of wisdom of this natural law. That when you lack wisdom, you will experience unwholesome results coming back to you. So when you're awakening on the path to enlightenment, what you're doing is you're developing wisdom around this natural law. And now with that wisdom, you'll make wiser decisions that produce wholesome results in your life. And you've done the same thing with the natural law of gravity, where you learned this natural law, you reflected on it to independently verify it, and you practiced it. That when we were all children, we didn't understand the natural law of gravity. So we struggled with that natural law. We fell down, we hit our head, we broke our toys, we had all kinds of difficulties. But now with the wisdom that we've cultivated over the course of our life, by the time we were 10, 12, 14 years old, we had fully awoke to the wisdom of the natural law of gravity. And we know that it's true. There's nobody who turns it on. There's nobody who turns it off. It's affecting all of us, whether we're aware of it or not. So even when we were 1, 2, 3 years old, this natural law of gravity was affecting us, whether we were aware of it or not. And then as we awoke to the wisdom of that natural law, we started making wiser decisions, and it produced wholesome results. We stopped struggling and having difficulties with that natural law. So when your mind's experiencing sadness, anger, frustration, and all these other discontent feelings, it's the mind lacking wisdom. It's struggling in the world because it doesn't understand these natural laws. It has pollutions in the mind that are hindering it from being able to experience the peace and joy of the enlightened mind. So as we go and I share the teachings on the natural law of Kamma, it's important that you don't believe them, but instead you learn it, you reflect on it, and you practice. And all throughout this course, I've been sharing with the students various teachings about the natural law of Kamma, helping you to understand things like the Eightfold Path and the 5 precepts and meditation training, the 3 poisons or the 3 unwholesome roots or the 3 fires. And now you're going to see how all of this is coming together through now investigating the natural law of Kamma itself, rather than talking about it, which is what we needed to do in order to help you understand it as we walk through the course. Now we're going to go into this natural law and discuss it directly. And as I do, feel free to ask any and all questions that you like here at the temple or online. You're welcome to ask any and all questions that you like. If you'd like to ask questions here at the temple, I would just ask that you use the microphones here, because that way the people online will be able to hear you. If you use the microphone, you just press the button. There's a gray button on front, and it'll show some lights, and then you just hold the mic up to your mouth, and we'll be able to hear you here at the temple, and they'll be able to hear you online. And then those of you guys online, you can ask your questions by putting them into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom. Or in Zoom, you can raise your hand electronically and ask any questions that you like. So first, let's just kind of talk about what is Kamma in general, and then we'll go in detail and talk about it in more detail. So it's a natural law that exists and is functioning at all times, whether you're aware of it or not. And everything the Buddha taught in one way or another is coming back to this natural law. It's not mystical or magical. It's not punishments and rewards. It's cause and effect, or action and result. There's no being who oversees this natural law and ensures that people get punished or rewarded. That's not even what the natural law of Kamma is about. It's not about punishment and rewards. You can think about it almost like a sequence of events of because there's a certain action, there's going to be a certain result, or because there's a certain cause, there's going to be a certain effect. So whenever we make decisions, whatever decision we make and we put out into the world, that decision is going to then produce a certain result, and we're going to experience the outcome of that. And when we're making wise decisions, we're going to experience wholesome results. And when we make unwise decisions, we're going to experience unwholesome results. And because of the unenlightened mind being unawakened or lacking wisdom of this natural law, it's going to tend to make unwise decisions. The unenlightened mind is going to tend to make unwise decisions that are producing unwholesome results to a certain degree. So when you're experiencing certain unwholesome results in your life, it's based on decisions that you're making, and now you're experiencing that coming back to you. But the beauty about understanding the natural law of Kamma is that if you can understand it and you start to practice it, is if there's anything in your life that you don't particularly care for, all you need to do is cultivate wisdom, make different decisions, and you will experience different results. Where oftentimes what we do in the unenlightened state, when we lack wisdom of this natural law, is we will tend to blame other people for the things that we experience. And as long as we blame other people for the things that we experience, we never have the opportunity to cultivate wisdom, make different decisions, and then experience different results. So if everything is everybody else, and everybody else is causing the unwholesome things that we're experiencing in life, then we never cultivate wisdom. We continue to make those same unwise decisions, and we keep experiencing the same unwholesome results. But by understanding this natural law, you can now cultivate wisdom, make better decisions, and then experience improved results in your life, to the point where you're experiencing only wholesome results coming back to you. So this natural law is affecting everyone, whether we're aware of it or not. Even when we were 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, you can see the natural law of gravity was still affecting us, whether we were aware of it or not. And this natural law is the same way. It's affecting us whether we're aware of it or not. But when we gain wisdom of this natural law, then we can consciously make decisions that are going to produce wholesome results for us. As I mentioned, there's no being that's overseeing this natural law. There's no entity or being that's overseeing it. It's functioning whether we're aware of it or not. And it's just happening through our own intentions, our speech, and our actions. When we're making decisions about our intentions, speech, and actions and putting those out into the world, then we will experience the results of that. It's not a system of punishments and rewards, or who's at fault or who's to blame. As I mentioned, I would think of it as a sequence of events if I was you, that there's a certain cause and an action, or a certain cause and effect, or a certain action and result. There's a sequence of events. There's a decision that's made, and then there's going to be a result of that decision. And as I mentioned, it's not mystical and magical. Sometimes people think about the natural law of Kamma like a black cloud that's following you around or something like this. And I've heard people talk about a bank account, that you're making deposits into this bank account, and now you can make withdrawals out of this bank account. This isn't actually true. If you have a black cloud following you around, that means you can't ever get out from under that black cloud. And this isn't actually true. That you can actually cultivate wisdom, make better decisions, and you'll experience better results in your life. So it's through understanding this natural law that you'll be able to do that. So just as a summary, this natural law is cause and effect, or action and result. It's the results of your decisions. That's what this natural law is, that it's your life, your decisions, and your results. And here's some words from the Buddha on the natural law of Kamma. As I mentioned, everything that the Buddha taught in one way or another comes back to the natural law of Kamma. Out of this book series, there's one particular book that has a consolidated amount of teachings that are around the natural law of Kamma. But we can really say this entire book series, this entire path to enlightenment, the Buddha is helping you to understand the natural law of Kamma. But there are certain teachings that he has on the natural law of Kamma specifically. And these are just two that I've kind of extracted to illustrate two important points for you as we start to peer into the natural law of Kamma and start to understand it. This first one, he says, beings are the owners of their Kamma, the heirs of their Kamma. They have Kamma as their origin, Kamma as their relative, Kamma as their resort. Whatever Kamma they do, wholesome or unwholesome, they are its heirs. What he's saying here is nobody else can create Kamma for you, that you are the one who creates your own Kamma. Somebody else can't rub off their bad Kamma on you, or somebody can't create bad Kamma for you. Some people refer to it as good or bad Kamma. I think of it as wholesome and unwholesome. I think this is a much better way to think about it. But nobody else can create Kamma for you. It's your decisions that is producing any type of Kamma. And that's what he's sharing here. And then the second one, he says, the results of Kamma, I say, are threefold, to be experienced in this very life, or in the next rebirth, or on some subsequent occasion. That some subsequent occasion is after that second rebirth. So if you're going to experience your Kamma, it's going to be in this life, in the next life, or some future life beyond that. And even the cycle of rebirth is something that you can independently verify. There's no belief even in the cycle of rebirth. You may not have the wisdom of how to verify it right now at this time, but if you like to gain that wisdom as you go deeper and deeper on the path to enlightenment, you can acquire the wisdom to independently verify the cycle of rebirth. So each one of us, I know with 100% certainty, have experienced countless births in the past. And this is just one birth of a sequence of many, 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 many births. And now we're experiencing the results of our decisions in this life and from our previous lives as well. And if we make certain decisions in this life, we'll experience those decisions, the results of those in this life or in some future life. So what the Buddha is saying here in this particular phrase is you can't run and hide from the decisions that you make, either wholesome or unwholesome. As you make wise or unwise decisions, you can't run and hide from those decisions. What you're doing on this path to enlightenment, among other things, is you're extinguishing your unwholesome kamma. This is how you get to enlightenment. That by the time you get to enlightenment, you're only experiencing wholesome results in your life. You're not experiencing unwholesome results because you're not making any unwise decisions. Your mind is fully awake to this natural law of Kamma, and by the time you get to enlightenment, you're only making wise decisions that continues to produce wholesome results for you over and over and over again. So you can't run and hide from your Kamma, and any Kamma that you create, it's you that's creating it. It's not other people. So when you start understanding this, and you can start seeing this to be true, then the next question becomes, well, okay, how do I extinguish my unwholesome kamma? What are the types of kamma? How do I extinguish it? And that's what I'm going to share with you now. So there's 4 different types of kamma. There's wholesome kamma and unwholesome kamma. And then there's old kamma and there's new kamma. What wholesome kamma is any decisions that you make that are harmless. When you're making decisions that are harmless, that it's not causing harm to any other beings, this is going to produce wholesome kamma for you. But when you make decisions that are harmful and it's harming other beings, this is going to produce unwholesome kamma for you. So this is wholesome kamma, making decisions that are harmless, and then unwholesome kamma is any decisions you make that are harmful. And the Buddha provides you guidance in the Eightfold Path and in the 5 Precepts and other places to be able to help you understand what would be harmless and what would be harmful. And then you don't believe those teachings. You learn them, you reflect on them to independently verify them through your own life and what you've experienced, and then you start practicing more and more. Because we've all lived long enough that we've made plenty of unwise decisions in our life. So when you're learning the teachings of the Buddha, you can look at what he's teaching you and be like, oh yeah, that leads to harm for sure, and that leads to unwholesome results for sure. Or, oh yeah, that definitely leads to wholesome results for sure. I've done those things before, and I know that it leads to wholesome results. You can directly reflect on that and see for yourself that this is the truth, what the Buddha is describing. And then with that wisdom, you start making wiser and wiser decisions about your life and how you interact in the world. And then more and more, you'll start seeing improved results in your life. Then there's something called old kamma and new kamma. What old kamma is any decisions that you made in the past that you're experiencing the results of right now in the present moment. New kamma is any decisions you're making right now in the present moment that you're going to experience the results of in the future. So let me give you some examples of this. So say in the past, maybe 3 years ago, I was filling out some forms to report my income to the government. And based on this reporting of income, I'm assessed a certain amount of taxes. And say 3 years ago, I lied on my tax forms. And now, 3 years later, in the present moment, I'm getting a notice in the mail that says, hey, we've seen this error on your tax form. You owe us $1,000 for that taxes. You owe us $1,000 interest, and you owe us $1,000 penalty. You owe us $3,000. This is old kamma coming back to me because I lied in the past. And now 3 years later, I'm getting this notice from the government. Well, now in the present moment, I have a decision to make because now I'm going to make new kamma. And in the present moment, I could continue to lie. That is one thing that you could do. But if you understand the teachings of the Buddha, you understand you can't run and hide from your kamma. You're going to experience it regardless. So if I rip this notice up and I throw it away, it's just going to come back and affect me later in the future because that would be new kamma that I'm now creating. And in the future, I'm going to experience this. So now if you're wise, in the present moment, you're experiencing this old kamma, you would like to extinguish it. This is old, unwholesome kamma that's coming back to you. And now I'd like to extinguish it. And knowing these teachings, it would be wise to tell the truth and use right intention, right speech, and right action. So now what I might do is I might call up the government. I might send them a letter and say, hey, I apologize. I see this error. I take full responsibility for it. I would like to pay this money back to you guys. But honestly, I just don't have $3,000. Is there something we can do? And now when you're taking responsibility, when you're being polite, when you're being kind, when you're being friendly, perhaps they say, hey, you know what? just pay us the $1,000. The interest and the penalty, we'll throw that off of there. Just pay us the $1,000. And if you don't have the $1,000, let's work out a payment plan and you can pay us over time. And this is the results of your decisions, that now in the present moment, you're creating new Kamma because you're now using right speech. You're speaking polite, kind, friendly, respectful. You're speaking in ways that is warm and gentle, rather than getting on the phone and being yelling and vicious and vindictive and hostile and bitter to the person on the other side. You're being polite and kind and friendly and respectful, and now it's going to produce wholesome results for you. So in the present moment, when this old Kamma is coming back to me that is unwholesome, the mind is like, okay, how can I extinguish this? Because I know whatever decision I make, it's going to produce new Kamma. And I could rip it up and I could throw it away. I could continue to lie. I could call up the government and yell and holler and be bitter with them. But none of that is going to create new wholesome Kamma. You would like to create new wholesome Kamma that is now going to be experienced. So that's where you might decide to write them a letter, a friendly, polite letter, or you might decide to call them up and then talk with them in a polite way that's going to be helpful and produce new wholesome Kamma for you. So this is wholesome Kamma and unwholesome Kamma, and then old Kamma and new Kamma. Now, the way that you create this unwholesome Kamma is based on what we were talking about yesterday with the 3 poisons, or the 3 unwholesome roots, or the 3 fires. Whenever you're making decisions through craving, anger, and ignorance, those 3 poisons that we talked about, those 3 unwholesome roots, it's going to produce unwholesome Kamma, or unwholesome results. Because craving, desire, attachment, that's that mental longing and strong eagerness, the mind chasing after the objects of its affection, thinking the next new shiny object waiting around the corner is going to provide some lasting satisfaction. This is where the mind's making decisions based on your own self-interest. This is your own selfish desires, that the mind's making decisions based on those things. And when you're making decisions based on your own selfish desires, it's going to produce unwholesome Kamma, or unwholesome results. Then when our anger arises in the unenlightened state, because the mind, when it has craving, you're going to get what you want in some cases and you'll get pleasant feelings. But when you have craving, desire, attachment in other situations, you're not going to get what you want. And you're going to get painful feelings like anger and frustration and agitation. And when that's arising in the mind and you're making decisions through anger, hatred, or ill will, or the lesser versions like frustration or agitation or annoyance, when you're making decisions through that, it's going to produce unwholesome results, or unwholesome Kamma, right? Unwholesome results would be unwholesome Kamma. And then the whole reason why craving and anger continues to exist in the mind is because of this ignorance, or the unknowing of true reality, the lack of wisdom, the confusion, the misunderstanding, the misperceptions. And when you make decisions through this ignorance or unknowing of true reality, that's going to produce unwholesome results. So every single decision that you see in the world that is producing unwholesome results, you can trace it back to craving, anger, and ignorance. Not only on a personal level, what you experience on a personal level, but even global conflict. You can look at global conflict and you can see how there's individuals who are making decisions through craving, anger, and ignorance. And because of this, it's producing unwholesome results, or unwholesome Kamma, on a personal level and also on a global level. Right? So this is what's producing the unwholesome results in one's life. So in the unenlightened mind, with craving, anger, and ignorance in the mind, an individual's making decisions through that, and now it's producing unwholesome results in your life. But you can transform this. That's what we talked about yesterday, as we talked about transforming the 3 poisons, or the 3 unwholesome roots, or the 3 fires. We talked about eliminating that out of the mind and now producing these wholesome results, or these wholesome roots. This is how you produce the wholesome Kamma. And these are the words of the Buddha, that the way you produce wholesome Kamma is through the very opposites of craving, anger, and ignorance. And you're working to arise these in the mind through your practice. You're looking to extinguish the unwholesome results, or the unwholesome Kamma, by bringing down the unwholesome roots, or the 3 poisons in the mind, and you're arising these wholesome roots. The wholesome roots are generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, which are the exact opposites of craving, anger, and ignorance. So with craving, the mind has those selfish desires. The mind's longing, yearning, and chasing after what it wants. But generosity is just the opposite, where you're living open-handedly. You're giving and sharing with others without any expectation of anything in return. And when you're making decisions through that, it's going to produce wholesome results for you. And then loving kindness is this genuine interest in seeing all beings be well, active goodwill towards all beings. And when you're making decisions through that, that's the exact opposite of the anger, the hatred, the bitterness. And now when you're making decisions through loving kindness, you'll experience wholesome results. And there's meditations to be able to help you to cultivate this loving kindness. And then the wisdom that you're cultivating by not believing any of the teachings, by learning, reflecting, and practicing. Now when you're developing wisdom in the mind, you'll be making wise decisions about all the different things that you have going on in your life. And now as you're making those wise decisions, it will produce wholesome results. But you need the basis of the understanding of the path to enlightenment in order to make these decisions that are wise. You're going to need to know about the natural law of Kamma and the Eightfold Path and the 5 precepts and meditation training and all these other things in order to get to this wisdom. And that's why I teach students to not believe anything about the teachings of the Buddha, because you would like to get to wisdom where you know the truth for yourself through independent verification and through your practice. So this is the wholesome roots that are producing the wholesome Kamma. Let me pause here and see what questions you guys have, and then I'm going to go in and share some additional things with you guys. But I would like to be sure you guys have an opportunity to ask any and all questions that you like here of what I've shared so far. So remember here, if you could use the mics, and if you're online, you can put that into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or in Zoom, you can raise your hand and ask any questions that you like. Do you guys have any questions here or online? Okay, looks like we have some questions coming in online. It says, I have a question about chanting. I noticed that there are different chants according to the different schools of Buddhism. Which is the one we should be chanting, or is it a matter of preference? So if you're learning in this tradition of the Buddhist teachings, you can chant the Pali chants. That's what we chant. You can chant whatever you like. It's up to you. It's your practice. But in this tradition, we use the Pali chanting, but you actually don't have to chant in order to get to enlightenment. This is the one thing that I'll teach, that I share with students. It's optional. Like something like the Natural Law of Kamma, you would have to learn that in order to get to enlightenment, but the chanting is not required. So if you'd like to chant the Pali chants, you can, but it's really up to you. It's your practice. Should the chanting be in its original language, or can it be in English? Again, it's really up to you. For me, I chant in the Pali language. I like to keep things in the traditional way, but there are some people who chant in English as well. How does one balance the desire to get already in life with unwholesome craving? So what you would like to do is extinguish all your cravings, desires, attachments, because any kind of longing, yearning, when you're chasing after something, it's going to produce unwholesome results like we're talking about here. This is where the Eightfold Path that the Buddha taught is going to help you to be able to extinguish those cravings. And it's a gradual training, gradual practice, and gradual progress. It's not something you're going to be able to do immediately and within, a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. It's a consistent, ongoing training of practicing the Eightfold Path and dialing that in closer and closer. How do we set the right goals in life without falling prey to craving and wanting this, wanting things that won't get us to enlightenment? So again, it's the Eightfold Path. You're going to have cravings between now and when you get to enlightenment. There's still going to be craving in the mind, but the more you practice the Eightfold Path to train the mind, that's what's helping you to knock down the craving. So I think you were in class on Tuesday because I recognize your name, but if not, be sure to go back and look at when I taught the Eightfold Path. It's on our YouTube channel. You can search. I've taught it many, many times, the Eightfold Path. You're going to need to know that inside and out, backwards and forwards, left, right. You're going to need to revisit that multiple times in order to really integrate it into your life. Okay, let me see if we have any questions on Facebook. Okay, no questions here? Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to help you to understand how to extinguish your unwholesome kamma, because now you might be starting to understand what's producing the unwholesome kamma, because you can look at your life and you can see any results that you experience. It's because of the mind making decisions in craving, anger, and ignorance. And this is where you need to reflect. You need to look inward. Don't just believe what I'm sharing with you, but look at your own direct experiences in any situations where you're experiencing unwholesome results, either in the past or now, or any time in the future. Look at your own cravings, desires, attachments. That's what's producing those unwholesome results. But then what you'd like to do is, as you're learning this Eightfold Path more and more, what the Buddha is teaching you is how to extinguish your unwholesome kamma, how to get to wise decision making, where you arise generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom in the mind. And now by applying the teachings and making wise decisions, you'll extinguish your unwholesome kamma. As I gave you that example of this tax notice coming back to you, you have decisions to make, and what you decide is going to produce new kamma. So what you would like to do is practice the Eightfold Path, right view all the way through right concentration. I taught that on Tuesday, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel if you weren't here for that. And you can learn each one of these factors, and you can dial it in closer and closer into your life. This is what's going to help you to extinguish your unwholesome results. Through learning, reflecting, and practicing this, it will help you to produce only wholesome results. The unwholesome kamma that you experience in this wholesome kamma that you would like to generate, the way that I think about it is I think about it like a garden hose. Every single one of us has this garden hose. And throughout our life, we've been putting mud into this garden hose. This is the unwholesome kamma, the unwholesome decisions that we're putting into our garden hose. And now, if you're deciding to get onto the path to enlightenment, you might be deciding to hook up your garden hose to the faucet. And now you're going to open this faucet and start putting some clean water into your garden hose. But this garden hose is going to spit mud for a while, because we put we put mud into this garden hose. So this is our old kamma coming back to us. Even though we might start making wise decisions because we're learning these teachings little by little, that's like opening up the faucet, but we're still going to get mud coming out of this garden hose. And depending on how wide we open the faucet is going to depend on how much mud and how quickly this mud gets out. Whereas if we're coming to the temple once every 6 months, if we're meditating once a week, okay, we've got like one little drip every once in a while going into this garden hose that's been compacted with mud. But if we open up that garden hose wider and wider, where we're reading the books, we're coming to the temple, we're meditating daily, we're developing our practice, maybe meeting with a teacher from time to time to get help, we've got more and more clean water going through this garden hose to flush out this mud. But even still, we're going to get some mud coming out of this garden hose. It's going to spit mud for a while. You're going to get your old unwholesome kamma coming back to you, because you can't run and hide from that. But the more clean water you put into this garden hose, eventually, as the mud's coming out of the garden hose, it's going to spit some clean water every once in a while. And then you're going to get some more mud. And then it's going to be clean water, and then you're going to get some more mud. But eventually, if you put enough clean water, if you put enough wise decisions into this garden hose, it's going to be nothing but clean water coming out of this garden hose. You're going to have nothing but wholesome results coming through in your life. But you need to put wise decision after wise decision after wise decision into your life. And part of that is, yes, reading, coming to the temple, learning the teachings, but then there's work to do outside of here as well. There's meditation that you'll need to do. There's making wise decisions in your relationships, the way you interact with your parents and your siblings, your friends, your coworkers. You're going to need to practice things like right intention, right speech, and right action. You're going to need to practice all the different teachings on the Eightfold Path, training your mind to interact in ways that is loving and kind and warm and gentle. And the Buddha is teaching you how to do that. Where in the past we might have been bitter and harsh and hostile, that's putting mud into the garden hose. So while you're on this path and you're making your way to enlightenment, and your mind still has these three unwholesome roots, you're going to be still putting mud into your garden hose. While you're trying to get this clean water into your garden hose to flush out this mud, you're still going to be putting a little bit of mud into your garden hose. It's not like you can just snap your fingers and instantly stop putting mud into your garden hose. So all the while, as you're bringing down your craving, anger, and ignorance, and you're bringing up your generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, you're still putting some mud into the garden hose. But you would like to put less and less and less and less mud into the garden hose and put more and more and more and more water into the garden hose so that you can completely flush it out and get to the point where you're only experiencing wholesome results in your life. So I'll share a couple of examples with you from my life so that you can hear how this works and how it might be different than what you're thinking. So in my childhood, when I was growing up, I had a very hostile upbringing. In our home, it was very aggressive, very hostile, very bitter. I learned about yelling and hollering and kind of fearing people into doing what it is that you would want them to do. When I would go places with our family, that's the way that our family functioned. So that's the way my mind functioned growing up. And this is what I was doing growing up, being bitter and harsh and hostile to other people. Well, as I was aging, I was starting to improve a little bit, but I wasn't really on this path, so I didn't know this path. But eventually I met my current wife, who we've been together now, I think 17 years or so. And of course, I was nice to a certain degree, but there were certain times where I would be bitter, harsh, and hostile with her, and I'd be aggressive, and I'd say things that were unwise. And then over time, that's what we experienced in our relationship. Well, then after we were together for about 11 years, and we were living here in Thailand, I ultimately got to the point where I was tired of all the bitterness and hostility, and I started getting closer and closer to these teachings, and I started practicing the teachings, and I started transforming my own mind. And as I did, I was being calm and peaceful and things like this and more joyful. But my wife, she had experienced all this bitterness and hostility from me. So even though I was being calm and gentle, I was still experiencing this unwholesome Kamma coming back to me. I was experiencing this bitterness and hostility. There were times I would come into the house and I would just not really be doing anything at all, and she would just start yelling at me and hollering at me, just like I would have done in the past. This was my unwholesome Kamma coming back to me that I had to experience. But in that situation where in the past I would have yelled and hollered right back at her and kept this problem going, I decided to do something different because I was training my mind. I knew that yelling and hollering back at her and being bitter and harsh and hostile wasn't going to solve the problem. So instead, I would remain calm. Sometimes I would just walk away as she would start yelling at me. Other times I would just sit there and smile. Other times I would sit there and listen to her, and I would say, "Anything else, dear? Anything else?" I would try to get her to get it all out because she had to extinguish it. It was like a fire. I was trying to get it all out. I was like, "Anything else? Anything else you'd like to say?" I knew this was my unwholesome Kamma coming back to me. It was my old Kamma. And then she was done. I would sometimes why her and I would just walk away. And more, she would realize that she was the one being bitter, harsh, and hostile. It wasn't me. So it took about 1.5 years that slowly but surely she started transforming her mind because I was doing something different. She could realize more and more that it was her being bitter, harsh, and hostile. And I needed to do the same thing with my mother as well, because growing up, there was a lot of resentment in my mind towards my mother. And it was only a matter of time before we were having fireworks when we would come together. Mom would come together, I would come together. She would pick up this rubber ball of anger and hatred and throw it around the room, and I would pick it up and throw it around the room. Next thing you know, we've got all these rubber balls of anger and hatred bouncing around the room. But I chose to do something different in this relationship too, where all through my life I wanted my mom to change. But I didn't realize I had to change first. In order for me to transform my life and my relationships, I had to change first. So I started transforming my life and I started doing things differently. So where in the past, when my mom would be bitter, harsh, and hostile, I would be bitter, harsh, and hostile and aggressive right back. I chose to do something different. When she picked up the rubber ball and she would throw it around, I would just watch it roll to the corner and let it lose its energy. I didn't give it any more energy. So when my mom would be on the phone and she would be bitter, harsh, and hostile, I would say, "You know, Mom, I'm going to get off the phone. I know that I've been bitter and harsh with you in the past, but I'm choosing not to do that anymore. I value our relationship more than being bitter, harsh, and hostile to you, and I'm not interested in damaging our relationship. So I'm going to get off the phone and let you think about what you just said, and then we'll talk another time, Mom. I love you." Right? I would get off the phone. And sometimes I wouldn't talk to her for 3 months or 6 months. And then I would call her back again, or she would call me. And then things would be fine for a couple of weeks. And the next thing you know, here she comes with some more bitterness. And I would do exactly the same thing. And I would just keep doing that And then slowly but surely, by the time she died in 2017, we had a fine relationship. Everything was completely fine for many, many years. We didn't have any harsh words between us, but it required me to make changes because my relationships were like a log jam. It's like a log jam, and I had to start pulling out these logs of anger and hatred and bitterness and hostility. And when I pulled out those logs, everything started flowing more readily. So what you're going to find on this path to enlightenment is that you're going to have certain relationships that you're in right now that are pretty hostile perhaps, or there might be some bitterness or resentment that you have, and you know that you're maybe not committed to this relationship, and maybe they're not committed to the relationship either, and you're going to need to let go of that relationship. And that's going to be how you clean up that particular karma in that particular relationship. That you're not interested in doing the work. You know that they're not interested in doing the work. There's too much hostility. You're just going to let go of the relationship and move on. And that would be a way to clean up that one and maybe others. Then there's other relationships, like a second category of relationships where you're more committed to the relationship. Like my wife, like my mom, things like this. I was more committed to the relationship. And I decided that I was going to do the work, and I was willing to do the work with them, and everything got solved. And now we have wonderful relationships. And then there's a third category of relationships that you're going to experience on the path to enlightenment, which are brand new people that you haven't even met yet. You don't even know who they are. You don't even know their names. And now when you're learning and practicing these teachings, you're only ever going to be loving and kind to those people. And now you only ever experience love and kindness coming back to you. Perhaps some of the friends you've met here in this community, you'll only ever be loving and kind to them. So that's all you'll ever experience coming back from those relationships. So this is how you clean up your karma in your relationships. There are certain relationships you're going to need to let go of and just move on and realize like, hey, you're not going to do the work. There's too much difficulties, and it's best to just move on from. And then there's other relationships you're more committed to, and you're interested in working those out. And then there's new relationships that you'll only ever be loving and kind in. And that's where you'll only experience love and kindness coming back. Because as you're developing your relationships over your life, you're going to experience the results of your decisions. Like when I was being bitter and harsh and hostile with my wife in the past, not only did I notice she was being bitter, harsh, and hostile with me, but I noticed my son was starting to be that way with her too. There was a period of time where I saw my son starting to talk to his mom in unkind ways. And not only did I need to extinguish the karma with my wife, but I needed to extinguish it with my son too. So I needed to start teaching him how to speak in more kind and loving and warm ways. So at the age of 6, I started teaching him how to do that. I started teaching him the 5 factors of well-spoken speech and right speech and all these different things. And now in our home, there's never any hostility. There's never any bitterness. There's never any arguments. Whenever we have something, of course, we disagree on things occasionally, and we just sit down and talk about it because we all are different people. We've had different experiences. We're going to have things that we disagree about. But disagreement doesn't mean that we have to yell and holler and argue. Disagreement doesn't mean that we need to disrespect each other. It just means that my wife has one opinion and I have a different opinion because we've had different experiences. She grew up in one place. I grew up in another place. We grew up differently. My son has a different perspective on things sometimes. So all we need to do is sit down and talk about it and then step away with a decision. And we still might step away with a certain decision that we disagree on, but at least this is the decision that we've made. And now we're going to walk forward with that. But we don't need to yell and holler and be upset with each other because that just degrades our relationships and it produces unwholesome karma for us. So when we practice generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, we'll experience improved results in our life. So you can extinguish your unwholesome karma and clean up your karma by making new karma, producing new karma, making new decisions that are based on right intention, right speech, right action, based in generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. And now this will extinguish all your old unwholesome karma. And you can get to the point where your relationships are fulfilling and satisfying and long lasting, that you're not going to keep experiencing the ending of relationships over and over and over again, where maybe you're doing things that are damaging relationships or maybe other people are too. So you can clean all this up. So then the last thing I'll share with you guys on this topic before I'll end and open up to whatever questions you guys have is talking about laws of society. Because sometimes people, when I talk about the natural law of Kamma and I say you can't run and hide from your Kamma, they'll say, hey, David, what about that person that, they found the bloody footprint in their house and, blood in their car, and there was a bloody footprint at the murder scene, and they went to court and they were found not guilty. Didn't they hide from their Kamma? And the answer is no, they didn't hide from their Kamma. You can't run and hide from your Kamma. The thing about the laws of society is that they're imperfect because they're created by human beings. The laws of society are not 100% your Kamma because they're created and administered by human beings. And why we should always aspire to have fair and equitable laws that are applied equally to all people, we should also understand that human beings have craving, anger, and ignorance in their mind, and they're prone to error and they're going to make mistakes. But the natural law of Kamma, it's not functioning based on any one particular being. So therefore, it's not going to experience the same thing like what you would experience in a court of law. In a court of law, you can be found not guilty, even though you were potentially guilty. You can also be found guilty when you were not guilty too, because the court of law is not perfect. But this natural law of Kamma is always functioning, whether we're aware of it or not, and it's going to be functioning perfectly. So in this situation where, let's just say somebody's bloody footprint was found at the murder scene, they had blood in their car, blood at their house, all these different things, but they were found not guilty in the court of law. Well, that is just one aspect of their Kamma, potentially going to prison or going to jail, being found guilty in the court of law. That's just one aspect of their Kamma. There's many other things that you may not be seeing that is the results of their decisions and what they're experiencing. And I've got a few of those examples here, that they're still experiencing consequences of their decisions. For example, they'll potentially have a bad reputation in the community because the community learns about this situation. They're going to be having this bad reputation. And then they can experience sickness, disease, physical and mental pain. They can have a shorter lifespan because there's a certain amount of anger and hatred that goes into killing an actual being, whether human or animal. There's a certain amount of anger and hatred, and that wears on your organs, and it actually shortens your lifespan. This is why people who murder and kill and have a lot of anger and hatred in their mind, they tend to have a lot shorter lifespan because it puts a big burden on the body to function. And you can experience a shorter lifespan. Even though you murdered somebody and you didn't go to jail, you can still experience a shorter lifespan. You can experience hostility, aggression, and fights and be killed yourself. Because if you had enough anger in your mind to go kill another human being, you're not just going to snap your fingers because you were found not guilty in a court of law and start treating everyone loving and kind now. If you look at some of these major cases like this, where people have been found not guilty, and you look at their life 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, they experience a lot of difficulties in their life because in their relationships, they're still experiencing the anger and hatred and bitterness. They're putting that out in all their other relationships, and this is all coming back to them. So you can see this in their relationships. You can also see that they have a loss of income or wealth, that this person who was potentially a murderer and that people know because it was so obvious, but they were found not guilty in the court of law, people feel hesitant to give them a job or help them to acquire income or wealth. So oftentimes people are struggling from that perspective. If they've been found not guilty, but everyone in the community pretty much knows that they did the crime because they have their bloody footprint at the murder scene and so forth and so on. They can experience difficulties in their relationships, right? Like I mentioned, they're not just going to snap their fingers and be a warm, loving person after they were found not guilty. They still have craving, anger, and ignorance in their mind. They'll have difficulty securing and progressing in employment, securing housing, acquiring basic necessities to sustain their life, like food, water, clothing, shelter, and medical care. This is all their Kamma coming back to them, and you may not be there to actually see that occurring. So sometimes people get so angry and so upset when they see somebody is found not guilty, when people pretty much know that they were guilty, or they'll feel so upset when somebody is found guilty when they're actually not guilty. But all of this is the natural law of Kamma functioning. It's something that you might not see all the intricate details of, but it's all happening whether you're aware of it or not. And then there's discontentedness and rebirth, which is also part of one's Kamma. So an individual who's murdered, they're typically going to at some point have guilt or shame or fear in the mind. All of this is coming back to them. Their mind isn't very functioning very clearly. Perhaps they're having difficulties functioning in other parts of their life. This is all the challenges that one would experience based on certain pollutions that are in the mind. And rebirth itself, being reborn continuously in all these various realms and potentially into the lower realms as well. So sometimes people get really worked up about, major court cases or something like this. And what I'm sharing with you is that people can't run and hide from their karma, that the guilty or not guilty verdict in the court of law is always going to be imperfect at best because it's administered by human beings. But this natural law of Kamma is functioning at all times, and it's affecting all of us. And you can't run and you can't hide from this. So the more you learn and you practice and you develop the wisdom, you'll be able to see the results of how you making wiser decisions are going to produce more wholesome results in your life. So let me know what questions you guys have here, either at the temple or online. You guys are welcome to ask me any and all questions you like about the natural law of Kamma. No questions? Okay, let's see if we have any online. Okay, we have some online here. Would mental health problems fall also into the natural law of Kamma? Yes, everything that you experience is a result of your decision. So if we're experiencing mental health challenges, like say, for example, like depression or other things like this, if oftentimes people are associating this with a defective brain, but what you can learn in these teachings that is actually these pollutions of mind that the Buddha taught, that when you uproot craving, anger, and ignorance out of your mind, you'll eradicate all the conditions that are producing what we refer to as depression, that can be eradicated from the mind. It's not a biological thing. There are chemicals in the brain that are being affected, but all of this is coming from the mind. When you train the mind and you purify the mind, it will affect the brain in a positive way. You can't go in with medication and tweak brain chemistry and eliminate cravings, desires, attachments. But when you're purifying the mind, it will improve the functioning of the brain. So anything that we experience, like a mental health challenge, this is because an individual just hasn't trained their mind. These are things that I experienced in the past, and I used to take all kinds of medicines, and I was able to get rid of all of those things because I was able to train the mind, and then the brain can function more optimally. But an individual may or may not be aware of those things. That's where the ignorance or the unknowing of true reality comes in, that the mind is having craving, it's having anger, and then there's this unknowing of true reality. And an individual might be convinced that they're mentally ill or that their brain is defective or something like this. But you can get to a point where you can see the truth, that by training your mind and uprooting these pollutions out of the mind, that you can get to the peace and joy that these mental health diagnoses, they're not permanent, and they can be, and the mind can be improved, and you can experience improved results. But that is our Kamma, that if our mind is clouded or lacking clarity, or if it's confused, this is all because the mind isn't trained, and that ignorance or unknowing of true reality is affecting the mind, keeping it in that state. But once you start cultivating the wisdom about this path, you can then make different decisions, train the mind, and then experience different results. You're welcome. Pleased to help you. Okay. Looks like Robert has a question.
So what about like a baby that dies or something like that doesn't have the chance to develop much karma? I guess that gets back to rebirth or previous lives. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is old Kamma from previous lives, that when you're reborn, what's making the decision of whether you're actually reborn or not is the state of your mind in your previous life. So at the time of death, if there's craving, desire, attachment in the mind, this is the fuel that causes rebirth. If you think about a fire and there's logs on a fire, the logs are the fuel. And as long as there's fuel in that fire, there's going to be a spark, and it's going to be carried by the wind, and now it's going to land and create a new fire. So as long as there's fuel in this old fire, it's going to create a new fire. And the same thing is true with the human mind, that as long as there's fuel in the mind, it's going to create a spark that creates a new mind or a new consciousness. So craving, desire, attachment, that fire, that's what's the fuel that's producing the next life. And now, depending on the condition of the mind in that previous life, it determines in what realm you're reborn. It determines which family you're reborn in, your condition in that family, and so forth and so on. And your body is old Kamma from your previous life, because the consciousness is coming into the womb of the woman. And now when that consciousness is coming into the womb, and now we have a fetus, that body is old Kamma. So if a child dies at the 6 months old, this is very unfortunate when these things occur, but this body isn't able to sustain life, but that body is based on the Kamma from the previous being. But then also at the time of death, an individual can get to enlightenment. So in some situations, a being, of course, the ideal goal would be to train your mind to get to enlightenment during this life, so then you can experience this peaceful and joyful mental state for the rest of your life. But there's the potential to get to enlightenment at death too. So in some situations, we don't necessarily know that this child that dies at 6 months old could potentially have gotten to enlightenment in that particular, at that time, at that death. So that's how we understand all of those kinds of situations, even like a miscarriage, right? The way that we understand it is that this is a being that's trying to come into the world, that is not yet ready to come into the world, and now a person experiences a miscarriage, right? So this is all cause and effect. It's not punishment and rewards, but just a sequence of events that is occurring from one thing that leads to the next, that leads to the next, that leads to the next, almost like a domino effect. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay. Well, it's 10:25, and I'm going to take a break here, and then we'll come back at 10:45, and I'm going to discuss this topic of what is merit. This is a particular type of wholesome Kamma that you're going to need to understand what this is. So I'll explain it to you starting at 10:45. So enjoy your break, and we'll see you guys in about 20 minutes. Okay?
Thank you again for watching. Enjoy your meditation. Look forward to seeing you online and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.